Hey, it's Mrs. Blankenbeckler again. I'm going to teach you guys how to do the composite functions, but sometimes you'll see not only f of g or g of g, but you're going to see, g of f, f of g and g of f, but g of g or f of f, and I'm going to show you how to do those. Okay, up here we have the same two functions we had in the first video. And this time, instead of doing f of g or g of f, we're going to do g of g. Okay, what g of g function means is I'm going to take the value 10 and plug it into the g function. And whatever I get out, I plug it into the g function a second time. Okay, so let's work this one out. Since we're doing g of 10, I'm going to take the 10 and plug it into the g function. So g of 10 equals 10 minus 3, which is 7. Then I take that output and I put it back into the g function again. So now I'm going to do g of 7. So 7 minus 3 is equal to 4. Okay? So what's g of 10? G of 10 is 4. Okay? So you just put it into the function twice. Now I did mention in the last video there are actually two ways to do these. Okay, I'm just taking the value and plugging it in, but you could also take and do the algebraic part first, so you can make the new algebraic equation and then just plug it in one time. So for example, if I'm doing f of g of 3, okay, in order to do that, I'm going to put my f function, or g function, into my f function. We did this in the last video, but let's just simplify that. That's going to be 2 times x minus 3 minus 10. So I've just replaced the x up here in the f function with the g function. That gives me 2x minus 6 minus 10, or 2x minus 16. So there's my new simplified function. Then all I have to do is plug in the 3 this time. Okay? So I'm going to plug in 2 times 3 minus 16, so I get 6 minus 16, or negative 10. So f of g of 3 is equal to negative 10. So you've got two options. One option is to plug it into the g function, take that solution, plug it into the f function. Or you can create the new composite function, which is this right here, simplified, and then just plug in f of g of 3. Okay, so two ways to do it. You pick the way that you like the best. Okay, now the last part is the domain. And I know some of you guys are struggling a little bit with that domain part, so let's take some time to look at that domain and range. Okay, I've got two problems on the PowerPoint that deal with domain and range. So let's look at the first one. The first one is the composite function, f of g of x. Okay, f of g of x. And f of x is equal to the square root of x. G of x is equal to x plus 2. And we're asked, what is the domain and the range of that function, of the composite function? So we're going to have to first make the composite function. So let's take the g function and plug it into the f function. So take this g and plug it into the f. So I'm going to get the square root of x plus 2, all under the radical. Okay? So that's my composite function. Now, I just have to look at the domain and the range for that. Well, what's the domain? What do we know? Under the radical has to be 0 or greater. It's got to be positive. So when is x plus 2 greater than or equal to 0? When x is greater than or equal to, subtract 2 from both sides, x has to be greater than negative 2. So our little square root function is going to look something like this. It's going to plug in here at negative 2, and it's going to increase and get bigger. Okay? Now let's look at the y value. If I plug in negative 2 here, negative 2 plus 2 is 0. Square root of 0 is 0. So it's starting at 0 and getting larger. Okay? So my x starts at -2 and gets larger. But my y, look at the y-axis, starts at 0 and gets larger. Okay? So let's look at our domain and range. Our domain is all the x's that are greater than -2, right? Along the x-axis, 2 and greater. And all the y's, or the range, is all the y's greater than or equal to 0. So all positive outputs. And that's a domain and a range problem. Let's look at one more of those. One more. Okay, the second one on the PowerPoint is f of g of x, and we're looking at f of x. Sorry, this whiteboard is just kind of leaning against my fireplace. G of x is equal to the absolute value of x. Okay? And that's an absolute value sign, so that should be a straight line. Yeah, right there. Okay. Now I'm doing the composite function. I'm plugging f into the g function. I'm sorry, g into the f function. So I'm going to take the g and plug it in right there. So I'm going to put 1 over that x is now going to be the absolute value of x. Okay? Now, we know that in the denominator, what's the only limit? What's the only limit of a denominator? The denominator cannot be equal to 0. So since it's just x, x cannot equal to 0. It can equal all other values except 0. So if you want to write it in that set notation we learned last week, x such that x is not equal to 0. That means all other real numbers. Okay? Now, what does it look like? What does a graph look like? What's one of those rational dealies? Okay? You could grab a graphing calculator and graph it. But these are always going to be positive, aren't they? This is a rational function. So if you remember from last year, rational was those two little L's. But we know that the output's never going to be negative. So it's always going to be positive. So this L is going to flip up to this quadrant, okay? Or you could grab a calculator. But we know that x has a hole at 0, and y can never be negative because we're taking the absolute value. So that means it would be all the y's greater than 0. Now it can't be 0 because you can't plug a 0 in. So it starts at, excuse me, I am popped up here. It starts with all the y's, greater than 0, but not equal to 0. So if you write set notation y such that y is greater than 0. And there's our final answer, okay? Hopefully that domain and range thing is making more sense to you. If not, bring your questions to class on Wednesday. We'll make sure we have lots of time to answer questions. We are doing one more lesson in this unit, and let's look at the homework this week, or today. Okay, it's page 122, 123, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 17 through 28 on those 2 pages. Now, this encompasses some evens, so I'll write up the even answers and put them in doc sharing just like I did Friday, so you guys can look at the even answers. Okay? When you're ready, and only when you're ready, take quiz 9. If you're not ready, don't take it. Okay? Hope this was a helpful video, and I will see you Wednesday.